through it, that we've got a new one of the committees. I think Barbara's probably very familiar with this. We're growing out the what was just the Veterans Affairs Task Force of the National Board, and reasserted the Armed Services and Veterans Affairs Committee of the NAACP. So one of the things we definitely want to talk about is how we can make sure that all of our branches throughout the state have operational Armed Services and Veterans Affairs committees. Kind of moving ahead, but we're going to go through the issues first.
Awesome.
Has it started getting cold there yet? I think your sound is off right now, Sadie.
Yes, it has. It's starting to get cold here. Actually, it's about 20 degrees this morning. And but God is good. Okay. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. Now, we're getting some of that here. We're starting most of our mornings right around 50.
Okay.
50, 56. And by midday, we're hitting right at about 60. And then it starts over again. Actually, we did have a couple of days where we started at 40, I think, before the sun came up.
Yeah. But we all well known here. We're happy to have you here today. I don't have to do much of that presentation. We know that you serve as Vice President for Policy and Advocacy Director of Washington, the best advocacy director. So certainly I present this to others. The Honorable Hillary Shelton. So I know that Barbara and I are on right now, but I know that others will be joining us. So Hillary, go on and tell us about the great work and how the new director of the United States. Welcome to Indiana State Conference. I present to you the Honorable Hillary Shelton. Can you hear me, Hillary?
Yes, I can.
Okay, I present to you the Honorable Hillary Shelton, who will share with us the new director of the United States Congress. I know that Barbara and I are on the phone. I know others will be joining us. But certainly, we thank you for taking the time in your schedule through all of the technical problems and all of those. So certainly, we thank you, Paul, for assisting Hillary on this being virtual today. So again, I present to some others.
Oh, thank you very much. Sadie Harper Scott's been a long time friend of ours in making sure we get the NAACP's policy agenda done right there in the great state of Indianapolis. We've worked together as she's taking the issues, working side by side with my other dear friend, Barbara Bowling Williams, who serves as our state conference president, also serves on our national board of directors, and we could not have asked for better leadership, not only for the state of Indiana, but also for the nation, as both of these people reverberate on what's going on throughout the United States. So it's very good to see you all. And just my only disappointment is not being there with you. I've always enjoyed being able to come into Indianapolis for the state conferences, as well as for the meetings at the state legislature to move the NAACP's legislative agenda forward. Let me begin by reminding us how we come to the agenda we do. You know, it was fascinating to me watching this last election and watching what was happening in the state of Virginia, and one of the arguments being made against the incumbent, that is the incumbent candidate running for the governor of the state of Virginia, or the Commonwealth, as they like to call it, was a number of issues were not being addressed as they wanted to. As a matter of fact, the opposition blamed the governor for not listening to parents that were being irate about things like racial theories and other concerns along those lines. So very well, what ended up happening in the final analysis was sad, and that the candidate that supported the largest part of the NAACP's policy agenda is not the candidate that won. But nonetheless, those are the issues and how they're being framed throughout the country. So as we're thinking about this, it's also important to think about how we come to our policy agenda. As you know, and as both Sadie and Barbara know well, the NAACP every year sets its legislative agenda. Its legislative agenda begins at the National Convention. Many of you have not only attended the National Convention, but you've also been involved in the resolutions process, how we set our agenda for the convention or through the convention, ratified then by the National Board and implemented by all of us. So the agenda that we talk about and we'll be talking about today is not something that is actually creative or made up here in Washington, D.C. It's not done at our national headquarters in Baltimore, Maryland. It's actually set by all of you. Many of you have come to convention, and you know that as we've listened to great speakers, those that have spoken to the issues of the NAACP, whether they are the president of the United States or a local branch president, raising issues and concerns and helping to educate, train, and then activate all of us on these issues, that agenda is crucial. The way it works is that any of you, as members of the NAACP, can submit through your units policies that you think the NAACP should take on. If you're noticing in your communities there's a problem with housing, then very well a resolution that looks at that from a national perspective is something that can be crafted there, passed there, and then moved to the national office to be considered by the resolutions committee and then on to the National Board of Directors. We know that those issues are important to us, and certainly part of the magic of the NAACP is that you guys are everywhere. The NAACP has units, as you know, in every state throughout the United States, but we are still on military bases in places like Italy, Germany, Korea, and Japan. The information and those who are members in those places also contribute to the process. They write the resolutions in what we call the Roberts Rules format. What that means is that you write it in which you lay out what the problem is. Whereas we're having a problem with policing in our community, and whereas we need to do something about it, and whereas the NAACP has always worked along those lines, therefore be it resolved. And that's where the action item comes in. As Barbara and Sadie have seen, the chairman of our National Board of Directors has served as the chairman of the Resolutions Committee of the NAACP, moving towards convention for the entire time I've been at the NAACP, which has now exceeded 20 years. And the only thing that he tells us is that it's great to be flowery and to get people excited about the issue. But the only thing important to me is the resolve. That is, what are we committing the NAACP to do to solve that problem? So all of you or any of you can draft those resolutions, send them forward through your unit, vote on it at your unit, and then move it forward to the national office to be considered. Once it goes through that process, we also take a look at what's going on throughout the rest of the country. What that means is that you're going to have about 40 members of the National NAACP that have been pulled together as a resolutions committee. Their job is to review and make sure that the resolution formatting meets the standards of the NAACP, make sure it's national in scope, make sure that it's something that we can actually work on together and is consistent with our values. They then send it forward to the National Convention. When we get to the National Convention, as I began saying a little earlier, we have a lot of fun raising the issues, catching up with people. It's a lot like a family reunion where we're there for the business of our communities. Though we elect about 2,200 delegates from each of the 7 regions, from each of the state conferences, and outside the United States as part of our regions as well. And they very well look at those issues and decide what's going on as well. The only thing that we do at our national convention, beyond hearing from the president, not only of our organization, the United States of America, other leaders from across the country and throughout the world. Yes, we've had presidents from other countries in Africa and other places come and address the NAACP. The only thing that we make sure happens then is that we debate the issues. They are sometimes amended. That is, resolutions come forward to amend the resolutions we're considering. We vote for or against, and then those that pass are moved to the National Board of Directors for the October meeting. At that October meeting, the board takes a good look at what's there and sees what they can do to refine some of the things happening. a good example. The NAACP's raised many issues about charter schools. We've come out in opposition to private charter schools, but our policy position around public charter schools is they still have to meet the same civil rights standards that we continue to work on as we think about our other public schools across the country. In other words, we don't want money taken out of the public school system to go to some private charter school somewhere that may not adhere to the same civil rights standards that we've worked so hard to demand of our public schools. The board of directors decided that it was a good idea to not only approve the resolution as it's come forward, but add a provision in it immediately in which we would hold hearings all over the country. So in each of the 7 regions that are the NAACP in one state or the other, we held hearings, public conversations. We heard from those in those local communities, and we heard from national leaders. We heard from the president of the NEA and the president of AFT and many other organizations as well. That improved the resolution, and what ended up happening along those lines is a report was crafted through that process, and the NAACP's policy on charter schools was fine-tuned and even improved significantly. So in other words, the process is an all-inclusive one that utilizes the genius of a structure of the NAACP to get these issues done. Once they pass those resolutions, they're then handed off to the various committees of the NAACP National Board of Directors and staff for implementation. After going through those processes, we know there are a number of issues that are so extremely important to us that we're still working so very hard to see fully implemented and addressed. One of those areas is very well the issue of infrastructure development. You're hearing a lot of the debate that's going on here in Washington, D.C. now is about our infrastructure. We know that our bridges need to be repaired, our roads need to be refined. We know new buildings need to be built to make sure that the services of government are more easily available to all of us Americans living here in this country. So it's a very hopeful idea to move us in that direction as we're trying to address our concerns. We also know that infrastructure development creates jobs and contracts to minority-owned contractors and others, in which these trillions of dollars, and yes, we're debating trillions of dollars here in Washington, D.C., can be fully implemented in a way that help improve our communities, the services of our nation and our government, but also provide a real opportunity for people to get jobs, contracts for small businesses, including minority-owned small businesses, Black and women-owned small businesses, and otherwise. It's a smart move forward. The NAACP created policies saying we want to make sure that a number of provisions and security measures are in place, including things like not disrupting our African-American communities, as we've seen happen too often. That is, as we've seen major building contracts and our processes across the country, oftentimes as they're declaring eminent domain, the eminent domain they're declaring is actually in our communities, with no satisfactory approach to make sure that those that live in those communities are taken care of, the community is preserved, and we have the opportunity also to seek that American dream. So those issues are huge for us on so many levels. And so as we're thinking about this and listening to what our president has to say, and we're very grateful that President Biden clearly understands the NAACP position. As a matter of fact, it became part of his presidential campaign and became also one of the issues in which the DNC adopted as part of its platform moving through its last convention. So those issues are all very important to us moving ahead. So let's talk a little bit about some of those issues right now. In addition to the issue of infrastructure development, we're thinking about our education system. We know that too many African Americans and others have found themselves susceptible to what is referred to as the student loan debt trap. The student loan debt trap. I was one of those in which my hair turned white early because I had so much student loan debt at the time I came out of school. In essence, we know that too often what that creates is a scenario where African Americans, who are disproportionately poor in the United States of America, by the way, that African Americans are either fearful about the debt that they will accumulate, or going through the process find it difficult to actually pay for school and the like. We want to see, and the president agrees, that we want to move to our junior colleges being free, that is no tuition being paid at all. And we want to control for that debt trap for student loans, even in other four-year colleges and on higher education through grad schools and the like throughout the country as well. It's a big issue. It's a big deal, and it makes a difference in our communities. Some of you may remember just a couple of years ago, probably the last Morehouse outdoor graduation ceremony, where one of their alumni stepped forward to give the keynote address at the graduation ceremony. At the end, as those were listening, they're excited about everything else going on, sitting with their caps and gowns on and hearing the great words from this man. The thing that stopped them all in their tracks is when he said, and that's why I brought a check to actually pay for all of the debt that any of you have incurred as part of the process of being able to attend this college and get to the point you are now. So in other words, you will be without student loan debt at the time you walk off of this football field here in Atlanta, Georgia. What that did, and as they began interviewing some of the students and parents after that, is set a whole new standard. Most of them were thinking about, I've got to find a job right away because I've got to pay off this student loan. I've got to find some way to make sure that I'm not indebted along these lines. What this meant is that they no longer had that debt. And what many of them talked about is whether they were going to go on to graduate school, some other professional school, medical school, or the like. They could move to do that faster because they were now debt-free when it came to those student loans that they were so deeply concerned about. Many of them said they would now move more quickly to start their own small business. So instead of having to pay off some of the student loan first and reconcile many of those issues and even work for a while, now they were starting student loan debt free, and they'd be able to start that consulting firm, start that local community-based business, and get those issues done a lot faster. Forgiveness of student loans is a huge deal for the NAACP. The bill that we're working on right now along those lines is also one that was introduced into the Congress by the chairman of the Education and Labor Committee of the House of Representatives, that many of you know very well because he was also a former NAACP branch president in Virginia. And during the time that, well, whether we're there in person or virtually, Congressman Bobby Scott is someone that carries our water for us in an amazing way. Let me just say, having friends like Congressman Scott usually means that I don't have to convince him that there's a problem. He knows there's a problem. It's where he lives when he thinks about his students very close to his congressional district in Hampton, Virginia. Yes, most of his district is part of Hampton and Hampton Institute. For those who are familiar with that very important HBCU, is part of that district as well. So as he's thinking about the agenda he's pushing on Capitol Hill, not only does it come up from years of being on the NAACP as the president of the Hampton branch and having served in the state legislature in the state of Virginia, but now serving in the U.S. Congress, he chairs the Education and Labor Committee, meaning that when we need the hearings, he can get them done. When we need the bills marked up, he can prioritize them. And he's done that every single step of the way. I saw Sadie Harper Scott's face when I mentioned Congressman Scott's name, because she knows him very well. If any of you attend the national convention, you've seen Congressman Scott at the CLE. You've seen him at the education and labor forums, including the political action and legislative forums that we do at the national convention as well. So our issues are moving forward. We've got friends in the right places. We're passing our bills in the House, in many cases still struggling through the Senate. So as we're thinking about education issues, we're also thinking about more federal resources to help with programs at our public school level, like Title I funding. Title I, as you may know, is a program that actually helps offset the cost of programs at the public school level, knowing that these are neighborhoods in which the property values are lower, the resources available for public schools are less, and very well we have to find other ways of offsetting that with programs like Title I. We're excited that we've increased funding for Title I spending to make sure that more money can go to each student at each of these schools, but also make sure that more students are covered as we move through that process as well. Title I funding for our public schools starts at pre-K, makes its way through the 12th grade, and is extremely important, again, in advancing the NAACP's policy agenda in education. Making sure there's more resources for our HBCUs, also not just through program funding for loans and for grants. Of course, Pell grants are extremely important to us as well. We're seeing an increase in Pell Grant funding too. What that means is that more money per student is available to help offset those extremely expensive prices of so many of these colleges and universities across the country. So that is very important to us. It's something we're getting done on the education cycle. And again, having good friends like Congressman Scott there helping to take care of our business along those lines helps move things forward. Let me say this. As long as I'm talking about Congressman Scott and education and labor, I'm going to shift from the education issues to the labor issues. One of the things you've heard even President Biden say is the support to increase the minimum wage. Increase the minimum wage. Many of you probably know that the federal minimum wage right now is $7.25 an hour. $7. What that means is that for a family of three, in which the head of household works 40 hours a week, every week, no time off or vacation or anything along those lines, still ends up making about $3,000 below the poverty line. That's a sad reality as you think about the poverty line, as arbitrary as that term might sound, is something that puts us in a much more challenging position. It means that people can't afford the basics of human survival, food and otherwise. And that's why we work so hard to make sure we increase it. We were able to increase it and see $15 being set right now with the new legislation that we're moving forward. And we're hoping to see it move even further. The NAACP's policy actually calls for $20 an hour as a minimum wage for people across the country. As we think about two issues, and it's good to think about them in these terms. There's a minimum wage, and then there's a living wage. Minimum wage, that's at the federal level, is $7.25 an hour, but a living wage varies with the cost of living in every community across the country. So as we're thinking about Indiana, looking at a living wage, we want to make sure that people are making enough money to survive well, to put the food on the table and the clothing on their children's back, to make sure that the loans can be paid off. And that is, they can also pay for their mortgages and their leases if they're leasing their homes. It's a huge deal. And very well, as we talk about these concerns, economics becomes crucial. One of the best quotes I've ever heard is about politics. We talk about politics all the time. The issues we're discussing now are issues that we're fighting in a political forum, whether that political forum is here in Washington on Capitol Hill with the US Congress, whether that political forum is with regulations and talking about the various agencies that are responsible for implementing those federal policies that are passed, or whether we're thinking about probably the most powerful entity that we deal with along these lines is our state legislatures. Again, that's why we are so proud that Indiana is thoughtful about the importance of not only having these conversations about the federal level, but Indiana is also very focused on making sure that the state legislature is hearing the concerns of the communities we serve and responding to those concerns, whether it's new hate crimes laws, whether it's new policing restrictions, whether it's the minimum wage itself. In other words, it becomes very, very important that we're thinking at all those levels as we're looking at full implementation policies along these lines. So we're thinking about the various issues that affect us as we move from the issues of education to the issues of labor. We're also thinking about making sure that the right people are in place so that we can unionize when we want to. Unionize means that we can do collective bargaining. We know that our labor unions across the country, working with organizations like the NAACP, have been extremely effective at making sure that our issues are amplified and implemented. I often say, as we think about This January, we'll be thinking about a number of issues. And in August, we'll be thinking about the March on Washington and then the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. One of the things we know about that March on Washington, as extraordinary as it was historic. We never had so many Americans coming out to march for a single cause as we did at that March on Washington in 1964. But we know, as we saw, and with great pride, those NAACP banners, our folks getting off those buses, coming from all over the country to participate. One of the things that we have to think about is who paid for the buses. Let me put it in these terms. The buses were loaded with NAACPers, but it was our labor unions, the AFL-CIO, the United Auto Workers, and so many others that actually paid for those buses to make sure we had the resources to advocate for the NAACP's position there on labor, on education, on integration as a big part of those issues. So those are all very, very important to us along these lines. So when these issues, whether thinking about the education issues like school construction, we're thinking about the new issues around infrastructure development, this school construction is a major part of, which also means we're thinking about technology. We have so many schools still in our local communities that have not been retrofitted for the technologies that allows us to do broadband internet and access to all that extraordinary data, not only from right here in Washington and throughout the United States, but that extraordinary data from throughout the world. You know, I had a chance to visit classrooms where they have what they call smart boards. It's like a big white board that when the lights are turned off and another switch is clicked, they're talking to students in China and Japan, and students in Zimbabwe and Senegal and other places throughout the world. In other words, the world gets smaller as technology works well. And our young people meeting with young people throughout, finding the common cause and finding the opportunity to work together in coalition in a way that benefits everyone. Those issues are huge for all of us as we move through. One of the big issues for us is an issue that also reaches our local communities, and that's the issue of policing and law enforcement. Policing and law enforcement. When we look at the data, what we see is that more Americans disproportionately of color are actually stopped on our streets, and in most cases found not to have done anything wrong. We know that racial profiling, sadly, is still one of the clarion calls of law enforcement, whether you're in Indiana or right here in the nation's capital of Washington, D.C. So making sure that we're addressing those concerns so our folks are not randomly stopped. And of course, the righteous indignation that I know I feel and so many others. When these things happen, you stop for no good reason. You're trying to make it to work or to pick up the kids from their sporting events, whatever the case is. And some police officer pulls you over just because they look at you and decided that if your skin is as dark as mine, that either you're on your way from having committed a crime or you're on your way to commit one. In other words, what they do is actually stereotype in a way that becomes deadly in so many ways across the country. In addition to racial profiling, another big issue for us is police officers' use of force. When we look at the numbers, and you don't have to go very far because when you turn on your TV, you're seeing someone else that was unnecessarily shot, aggressively beaten. We remember too well what happened to Rodney King in the 1990s, and sadly, though thankfully, because of our cell phones, because of the video feature that's on those cell phones, we're able to capture more and more of the bad behavior by police officers that too often undercut their ability to do an effective job for us. In other words, when someone gets pulled over, the first thing that goes through my mind is they just pulled me over because I'm Black. I know I was driving right. I turned my signal on when I made that turn. I turned it off when I finished. We have to make sure there is a backup. We also have to make sure there's accountability among those police officers. And that's why the NAACP did a number of things. Number one, working with our friends in the Congress, Sheila Jackson Lee, and many others. Sheila Jackson Lee, by the way, usually comes to our national conventions too, represents part of the city of Houston, but also now serves as chair of the crime committee, of the crime subcommittee of the Judiciary Committee of the House of Representatives. In other words, when it was time for us to hold hearings on the End Racial Profiling Act, Chairman Jackson Lee made sure those hearings were held. When it was time to make sure the right people were testifying, Congresswoman Jackson Lee, Chairman Jackson Lee in this particular case, made sure the right people were able to testify. In other words, we have another friend that's now chair of that committee, that's also a member of the Congressional Black Caucus, that understands the issues and is championing them for us in an extraordinary way. We made sure that all the provisions that we wanted were in those bills. If you go back and you look at the NAACP's agenda, even though they were singled out individually, we took all those issues, put them together in one bill. We put Mr. George Floyd's name on it. He was sadly an excellent example of the challenges that we have across the country, because we literally watched in real time, as it was recorded, a man being executed on the streets by a police officer for no good reason at all. And the police officer all along believing that it was okay for him to do it. And that even as all those people, we've gotten smarter about this. I saw all of our young people with their telephones in their hands, holding it up so they could video the entire thing, that actually became just the evidence we needed for another champion of ours. Keith Ellison is the state attorney general for the state of Minnesota. Keith Ellison, you may remember, has also been at a number of NAACP national conventions. He was the first African-American, let me back up. He was the first Muslim, openly Muslim man to ever be sworn in to the United States Congress. So he brought those values with him and put up an extraordinary fight, and we won that one. The officer was found guilty. He is now serving time in prison for having killed Mr. Floyd. And then indeed, we can move a few steps further. Another friend of ours, another champion, that's brought many of the issues to the national convention as we've been educating people across the country. Look, let me just drop a couple other things, because I'd like very much to open up for any questions that folks might have about these issues as well. On the international front, there's some major struggles on the continent of Africa, from funding for vaccinations for those that don't have it. If you look at the map of the World Health Organization, you'll see it color-coded with areas that have the highest numbers of coronavirus, and those that are actually inoculated or vaccinated to be able to address those issues. And as you're skimming across the world, what you'll see is the continent of Africa is overly representative of those that have not been vaccinated. I have a brother that lives in Guinea-Bissau, West Africa. I've asked him how things are going on the ground, and he says that people are adhering to all of the preventative measures. People are wearing their masks, they're washing their hands regularly, doing everything at that end, but we have not gotten our vaccines yet. So in other words, moving in the right direction, willing to do the right thing, unlike too many we've heard of right here in our own country, but nonetheless being left without the defense of a vaccine. We're pushing now through representatives of the State Department, as well as those who represent the International Affairs Committee of the House of Representatives, to make sure more resources are available. We have plenty of vaccines here in the United States. As a matter of fact, sadly, we've seen that people not even showing up to the vaccination sites to get them done. And once they've been taken out of the ice, in many of these cases, if they're not used that day, they have to throw them away. They end up being wasted. We want to make sure that none of those are wasted. We want to make sure that people have real access to getting their vaccines. We want to make sure that even our brothers and sisters that live in the Caribbean, that live on the continent of Africa and throughout the world, have what they need to be able to be protected along those lines. So, Sadie, why don't I stop there and say the issues are big and we need everyone involved in helping us move forward. We're grateful that you've sent us Barbara Bolin Williams to make sure that as we're crafting and implementing programs at the national level, we have the insight that comes from Indiana, and it comes from Barbara and the great things that she provides. I'm also grateful again that Sadie Harper Scott is right there moving our legislative agenda in the state legislature and thinking in terms of our political issues right there in Indiana. We've gotten a lot done. The problems are with us in many areas. We've not forgotten, even as the attention has gone to coronavirus and infections, that it is a pandemic. It is that huge. But we cannot allow that to cover up so many of the other things that are still undone. We still know that African Americans are disproportionately unemployed. No, African Americans disproportionately are unable to own their own homes and have the benefit of actually building equity along those lines. We know that African Americans are disproportionately represented of those who are unable to fulfill that dream of being able to get a college education. We're moving in the right direction. We have to make sure the right resources are available to us. We have not forgotten, and the agenda goes forward. Someone once said, and I think one of the chants in the marches across the country for our friends at Black Lives Matter and many other places, is that it's not about the minute, it's about the movement. The NAACP has been part of advancing and pushing that movement forward for over 100 years. We understand the value of the experiences we've had from the very beginning, and we understand the best ways to bring those together to be successful as we continue to move our way through the 21st century. Listen, thanks a million, and look forward to our conversation.
Wow, Hillary, I am so always excited what you do and what you bring to the table. All of the information that you bring with us, we are just so floored and so excited about that. You are on the front line. You do an amazing job. And I know with all of this, we capture people, and we just want to salute you for all of the great work that you do here in this community with the Indiana NAACP and the state conference. We also want to salute you for your extreme hard work that you do throughout this great state of the United States of America. We salute you for being that amazing board member, along with our state conference president, Barbara Bolin Williams. We just want to thank you. We want to thank you. We know that we have a lot of people that are in other sessions right now, and we are so amazed to have you. I know that we just cannot do without you. We want you to know that. But Mike, we're looking forward to you February 28th at the Legislative State House. We will be in Indianapolis on the 28th of February, and we look forward to hearing such an amazing work that you will continue to do with your journey as a new direction with our United States Congress. We appreciate your hard work. I know that Barbara Bolin Williams is going to come back in the room, and she's in the other session, but certainly your schedule is tight. But I'm going to reach out to you again this week. So look at your schedule this week, one evening, so that we can draw the entire 22 branches. So because of those technical difficulties that we had today, we certainly want to make sure what you've talked about today, we know that you are live right now on YouTube, but we want to YouTube you for the second time this week. So if you don't mind, look at your schedule for like an hour or 7 o'clock in the evening, so that we can take you to the next level, because we know that there is no other Hillary Shelton.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you for such an amazing presentation, and we salute you. Thank you so kindly.
Thank you. Thank you. Let me say this as we're closing. I have 2 documents I'll be sending to you to send out to everyone. One of them is this document that includes a nice summary of each of the bills as part of our legislative agenda on Capitol Hill, and even speaks to issues that should be implemented there on the ground. The other is accountability. This is our legislative report card for the 116th Congress. So you know the NAACP has been great in the Congress since 1914. And this document actually has how each of the 435 members of Congress voted in the last Congress, how each of the 100 US senators voted in the last Congress. So you can pull this down and see how those members of Congress vote. As you've experienced, and I've experienced at NAACP events, you have some members of Congress that will show up. They'll come and say how grateful they are for being able to serve you. But when we look at how they voted away every legislative aspiration that we could have possibly have ever had. So again, we want to make sure that you're fully informed, and this document will do just that for you at the state of Indiana.
Thank you so much, Hillary. Again, thank you so much. Thank you so much on behalf of the NAACP, Indiana State Conference, and our 22 branches. We thank you so much, and have a blessed day.
You too. Thank you very much.